Okay, so let's start. So thanks to everybody, and welcome to the first of the seminar series, the spring seminar series of the Media and Policy and Culture Group at the University of Antwerp. We originally imagined these seminars as something for that would be, mainly framed for the group itself, but it's really great to see participants from all over, from different parts of Belgium. And I see participants from Finland, Vietnam, Australia, and Ireland, I think, as well. So just a little bit of housekeeping stuff at the start. The core of Johan's talk today will take about 45 minutes. We're booked in for about 90 minutes, so we'll see how we go, but we should have lots of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So please, I really encourage people to interject or not during the core talk itself, but contribute afterwards. You'll have the option of appearing on screen. You can use the chat function on Zoom if you'd like, and I can voice the question for you. And I think also as well, I can't quite see the setting in Zoom now, but you have the option of putting your hand up as well if you want to contribute. As you probably have already been alerted through the Zoom voice, the talk is being recorded. We're not quite sure what we're going to do with the talk, whether this is something we can talk about more, Johan, whether we'll put it on the internal system at the university where only you Antwerp people can access it. It may possibly end up in YouTube as well. And I guess, what else in terms of housekeeping stuff? The tweeting thing, I broached that with Johan. He's quite happy people want to tweet during the talk as well. So that's all good. Okay, so let me briefly introduce our speaker today, Johan Farkas, who's a PhD student in Media and Communication Studies at the University of Malmö. So a lot of you are already familiar with Johan's work. And by any definition, he's been a remarkably prolific scholar over the last few years. But I think especially prolific for somebody who's still, correct me if I'm wrong, Johan, you've just started out on the final year of your PhD, if I have it correct.
Next year will be the final year.
Next year will be the final year.
So we're getting towards the end, but I also have to intensify the writing of that and not all the side projects.
Well, anyway, it's clear that you've had a lot of very successful, well-read, well-cited side projects over the last few years. I first came across Johan's work in the article himself and his co-author Jannick Schou published in Javnost in 2016 called Fake News as a Floating Signifier. And it was just one of those articles, the minute I saw it, I had an idea what the argument was, because it was using this Laclauian language, and which seemed like a perfect fit for discussing an idea or so-called concept like fake news. Because, of course, I think sometimes a problem with the analysis of fake news, it's treated as a concept rather than this signifier that's weaponized in all sorts of problematic ways. So obviously, Johan today is speaking about how the argument of that original argument subsequently developed into a book, again, co-authored with Jannick, called Post-Truth, Fake News and Democracy. So I don't think I have to say anything else in terms of introductions, Johan. I'll hand it over to you, and we really look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to join here from Copenhagen. So the story of this book and kind of the starting point for also that article that came before it, Fake News as a Floating Signifier, is that I was just getting into academia and studying fake profiles, particularly how fake profiles on social media were used for disseminating racism, racist propaganda. So I was studying that already, and then obviously what happened is that everyone started asking me and my co-authors, do you study fake news? Do you think we live in a post-truth era? And so I became increasingly obsessed about thinking about my response to that question and what that question even meant. And then started studying how these discourses constructed the notion of fake news and post-truth, and also trying to understand the power relations and struggles related to that. So the short answer I've come up with, and this is then like, if you just want a yes/no answer to my talk and leave for today, I don't think we live in a post-truth era. And I don't think it's not just because it's a bad description of the state of our societies, but also because it contains some deeply problematic normative visions for what democracy should be and where democracy should be heading. And so that is kind of what I will be giving. That was the short answer, but now I want to give the very long answer as to how I came to that conclusion and what it is about these post-truth discourses that me and my co-author find disturbing, but of course also fascinating that they've gripped people's attention to this extent. So I want to dive right in and start with kind of a quote that really condenses post-truth discourses and the notion of post-truth, which is this quote from Emmanuel Macron. So Macron visited the US in 2018 and held meetings with Donald Trump. And then he gave this speech before the US Congress. And in this speech, he said, "To protect our democracies, we have to fight against the ever-growing virus of fake news, which exposes our people to irrational fear and imaginary risk. Without reason, without truth, there is no real democracy, because democracy is about true choices and rational decisions. The corruption of information is an attempt to corrode the very spirit of our democracy." So in this quote, we really find neatly condensed some of the key arguments we find across what we call post-truth worlds in our book, or post-truth discourses. So these ideas, narratives, imaginaries around how we live in a post-truth era. So their argument goes that democracy is about truth, and truth is about democracy. And currently, we are facing an attack on our democracy, which is primarily about truth. And this attack consists of fake news, which is very similar to a virus, which is a very powerful and prevalent metaphor, which we've only seen grow more prevalent now during COVID with the notion of the infodemic. But already before COVID, the notion of fake news being a virus that needs to be eradicated through radical means was in many ways, had already in many ways become hegemonic. And we, of course, don't just find that with Macron. Across the world, political elites and economic elites and academic elites have formulated this idea again of the biological threat of fake news spreading like a virus, killing people's minds, as formulated by Apple CEO Tim Cook in 2017. So across the world, we find this narrative of a sudden and dramatic threat towards democracy, which is very similar to a disease. It is spreading and replicating like a virus, and thus we need to study fake news pathogens and the epidemiology of fake news. And what is interesting again in this narrative is not just that we're seeing a lot of false information, but the argument also goes that we're facing a new type of threat. It's not just the old story of politicians lying or people being misinformed about things, but it is the people themselves that have changed in some ways. Because this disease is proving alarmingly resistant to treatment, which also means we need to develop new cures, new vaccines against fake news. Again, a narrative that has only become more prevalent since due to COVID, but was already prevalent when we wrote our book before it. And the reason, again, that we are in a post-truth crisis is that the people have changed. People have, for example, become trapped in filter bubbles, in echo chambers. The masses have in some ways been changed so that they are separate from reality. And thus, we can't just rely on the same measures as democracies have used before: education, journalism, fact-checking. We need something new, we need something radical, and we need it fast, because otherwise democracy will go under. So in our book, we asked this difficult and big question of saying, like, is this the state and future of democracy, right? So we try both to understand how do these narratives present democracy, both the state of democracy, but also the functioning of democracy as a political system, and what kind of visions for the future of democracy are they offering? And this is also what I did want to talk about in this talk. So first I want to talk a little bit about why I think these post-truth discourses matter, and I think we need to take them very seriously and also be very critical towards these kind of narratives. Something which I think far too few people have done, also researchers. We've seen this explosion of research into fake news, but the vast majority of it just accepts these kind of narratives of fake news being the problem, right? Being this concrete phenomenon that we can study, and not a signifier that is way larger than just something going on online, but about normative visions for the future of democracy. And then I want to dive into the age of post-truth. What are the key narratives presented here? I already touched upon it with this Macron quote, but what is the age of post-truth according to post-truth discourses? And then also, importantly, what are the proposed cures to stay in this vocabulary? Because what is important to highlight is that these discourses do not just present a description of the world. They also deeply material, in the sense that we see policies around the world, new technologies and so forth, funding for various security agencies and so forth being rolled out across the world. And then in the second half, I want to switch gears a little bit, which we also do in the second half of our book, and try to put this narrative into perspective, both a bit historically, but also in terms of radical democratic critique of these discourses, in terms of what democracy is and should be, and the implicit normative ideas that we find within these discourses. And that will lead me to arguments towards the end about the dangers of these discourses. Because, as I said in the beginning, I think post-truth is not just a kind of faulty way of approaching the state of democracy, but it is also one that is leading down a dangerous path in terms of entrenching current problems of democracies. So, but first, why do these discourses matter? And I mean, we draw on Laclau and also Mouffe, as Sean said in the introduction. And from this perspective, we argue that these discourses are highly important because, again, they not only describe something, but they also put out a blueprint for a vision of the future. What should be done to democracy? Where should we be going? And again, because they have become so powerful, they are in many ways becoming prescriptive in terms of where, what kind of policies are being implemented and that kind of thing. And then also from this Laclauian perspective, we don't just see discourses as text, but as also something deeply material. Again, these policies and these tech solutions that are being rolled out, they are all deriving from these discourses, or part of these discourses, and they also need to be taken into account. So we try to take these discourses seriously in the sense of asking, how is democracy imagined to be in a crisis? What is blamed for this crisis? And what are the kind of solutions presented to the crisis? And we do this by compiling, and we compile an archive of academic publications and news publications, mainly from the US and UK, around fake news and post-truth. And then also included some additional literature, for example, the speech from Macron and so forth. And of course, this is not in any way like exhaustive of the fake news debate, right? Because as you all know, it has become a key topic in, again, pretty much all countries around the globe. So we are, of course, just providing, and we are trying to look into what have been some of the prominent ways in which this has been described, and how can we see that materialize in terms of visions for democracy that are also being rolled out. So a disclaimer is then that we don't actually try to map fake news as a phenomenon in this book, right? We don't try to answer how much fake news is out there or how big a threat is it towards election. As I said, otherwise, I have studied the use of fake accounts, both by white supremacists, but also by, for example, the Russian Internet Research Agency. So these questions, although I wouldn't use the term fake news there, interest me. But in this book, what we try to do is try to understand how these narratives have played out and how they shape current politics. So what is the age of post-truth? I already outlined some of the core components. But in terms, something that's interesting about the term, of course, is that it was popularized before the rise of social media. In this book by a journalist, and the book is called The Post-Truth Era. And he argued that it was things like the Iraq War and the lying in that regard, and that had led to people no longer caring about facts to the same extent. But as we all know, it really exploded into popular discourse in 2016 when Trump came into office and Brexit took place. So it has lingered in the background for a while, but it really exploded into public debate alongside fake news. And when we study these discourses, obviously we don't just find one coherent narrative. Everyone is proposing the same kind of solutions, or everyone is pointing to the same problems, but we do find commonalities across these differences. And these are the ones we focus on. And these are basically the ones that Macron summarized, that we have a sudden crisis of democracy. This crisis is caused by the demise of truth. Democracy is about truth, and thus we need radical measures, and we need them soon again, because again, this is this sudden explosion of a problem. And then we find a series of what we call villains in the book, a series of explanatory factors as to why we are seeing this sudden crisis. And these three key villains, or three of these key villains, are journalism. So some argue that it is declining standards of journalism, since also revenue from journalism has been directed towards social media. That has led to declining quality, and thus we're seeing this kind of post-truth era. As the director of the fact-checking site Snoop said in 2017, we have a bad news problem, not a fake news problem, right? Others, of course, also cast journalism as more of a victim in this. Fake news is taking the traffic away from the real news. But in both cases, we see journalism as being very central to this, to explaining why we are in this supposed post-truth era. Then, not surprisingly, we have social media companies, especially Facebook, being central in these narratives. And again, the argument is not just that there is a lot of false information out there on social media, but that social media are changing people in key ways, putting them into these filter bubbles or echo chambers and so forth. And what is, of course, interesting to note in that regard is that empirical research has not really supported this notion of these hermetic, of these sealed echo chambers to the same extent that they are in popular narratives at all, right? But this is a key part of explaining why we are in this post-truth era. And then finally, related to that, we have the democratic masses. Society has become so complex that people no longer understand how politics work, and they have also become trapped in filter bubbles, and thus we don't just have uninformed publics, we have misinformed publics, as a very prolific quote from this material said. And what is, of course, interesting is that immediately when we look at these explanations, journalism, technology, and the masses have changed, and thus democracy is going down the drain. We can quickly see that there's nothing particularly new about that kind of narrative, right? blaming journalism, technology, and the masses. These are like things that have been blamed since modern democracy really took off. So we for example, are reminded of Walter Lippmann, the American intellectual's critique of democracy in the early 20th century, where he argued that people no longer understand the complexity of democracy and don't have time to stay informed. And thus, as he argued, we should just accept that it's the influential men, as he called them, who decides, right? So this kind of narrative is not new in itself, but of course, what is new is the notion of post-truth, the signifier kind of holding all this together, and the notion of this being sudden, something sudden happening with this that calls for these radical measures. And again, the suddenness is key. This is from one of the many popular books that have been written by journalists arguing that we live in a post-truth era. And so in this quote, it says that just as 1968 marked the revolution in personal freedom and the yearning for social progress, 2016 launched the post-truth era, right? Others have argued that 2016 was more when we perhaps realized we were in a post-truth era. But in both cases, we have this kind of idea of something radical and sudden happening that is sending democracy into a state of chaos. And thus this leads me to talk a bit about the cures, because we are seeing right now the material consequence of that, and that is a struggle that is very much ongoing, and again, very understudied. There are all these studies of fake news, how it spreads online, but very little about these, for example, different laws that are being implemented and task forces and money allocated to military agencies and so forth that are all resulting from this narrative of a sudden crisis. But so one thing we're seeing, again, across the world, truly a global phenomenon, is the implementation of fake news laws or anti-fake news laws. The governments in various ways and in various harshness, making it illegal to spread or circulate fake news. And yeah, we're seeing that in some European countries, we're seeing it in Southeast Asian countries, some African countries, South American countries. So this is something that is playing out as we speak across the world. And COVID has also, in some sense, intensified that, both the use of these laws, but also new laws being implemented as part of like state of emergency regulations in a number of countries. We're seeing also that spreading fake news about government's way of dealing with COVID becomes punishable. And of course, human rights groups have consistently warned against these laws and consistently said that these will not solve the problems of democracy, but will likely contribute to existing processes of de-democratization or democratic backsliding. But again, if we look at it from the perspective of this post-truth narrative, it makes a lot of sense, right? Fake news is like a virus, and we need to eradicate that virus fast, otherwise democracy will die, right? And from that perspective, it makes sense that governments are saying, yeah, we need something radical and we need to make fake news illegal, thereby removing the virus, thus saving democracy, right? But of course, this is one of the problems with this kind of narrative, because as it says here at the bottom, what is fake news and who will define it, right? And this is, of course, where it becomes interesting to look at what fake news is or how that is defined. And this is, again, what we wrote in our article that came out before the book and then expanded on in the book. That as soon as you look into how fake news is actually used and has been used since it exploded into popular discourse, there is, as you all know, no consensus about what this means. It's not a specific phenomenon. It is one of the most politicized concepts of our time. And when we talk about it as a floating signifier, what we mean, and here we draw again on Leclerc, is not just that it's vague. I mean, there are plenty of vague concepts out there, right? The thing about fake news as a floating signifier is that it is being defined dichotomously by opposing political projects. So if you ask Donald Trump what fake news is, we kind of all know that we will get a clear answer, right? Fake news is not vague to Donald Trump, but it is just a completely opposite meaning of what someone else would define it as, right? So if Trump gets to ban fake news, he might appreciate that kind of thing, but he would obviously be banning something very different than another politician. And this is, of course, a key problem that is ignored often in scholarship also. So scholars are presenting this as a kind of clear-cut phenomenon that is threatening democracy and is like a virus, and politicians are grabbing onto that and saying, yeah, sure, let's remove it, right? Without it, scholars haven't really thought about these ramifications of that. And this was also the problem with Macron's speech before the Congress, US Congress. So the speech I quoted in the beginning. So this is Washington Post writing. Macron said fake news, and everyone heard their own definition, right? So, so in Congress, we can imagine both Republicans and Democrats nodding to this threat of fake news, but of course, hearing something very different. And this is, of course, the key problem with that kind of narrative, and what is often downplayed in journalism and in scholarship on these topics. And I mean, an example from 2019 that really captured this, or there's been many examples since of fake news as a floating signifier, but this is one quote, for example, which is very much what we find in our archive as well, right? Which you could see in a journalistic article, that we see misrepresentation, and thus we need to counter the dissemination of fake news. And that was said by a representative of the North Korean Central News Agency, right? We've also seen fake news being used by the Chinese administration to talk about their persecution of Uyghur Muslims. And so we're seeing fake news take on all these different meanings and all these different lives, while these fake news laws are being implemented across the world, often directly legitimized by the kind of discourses that have proliferated also in scholarship, that it is a virus and it needs to be removed, and otherwise democracy will die. So other perhaps less extreme or radical measures that have been taken are things like task forces. So we've seen in the European Union, for example, the East Stratcom task force, where diplomats are doing fact-checking of Russian disinformation. But of course, what those kind of initiatives have also been criticized for, and what has often been neglected, is that in those cases, it is state agencies engaging in a form of counter-propaganda, right? Having diplomats do a job that we normally would consider a journalistic job, to do critical investigations of different types of information and that kind of thing, right? And during COVID, actually, it came out that the East Stratcom task force in the EU had done a report about disinformation, where there had been a whole section about Chinese disinformation around COVID, which had then been taken out from above, like EU politicians higher up in the hierarchy, not wanting to offend China to the same extent as they wanted to offend Russia. So it becomes, of course, implicated in all these wider political struggles, these task forces, which is often again downplayed in coverage of them. And then finally, we have techno-solutionism, the idea that we should leave this to the market, in the sense of these private tech companies that have become only increasingly powerful, that we should just leave it to them. And that's something, again, we see politicians make that argument, journalists, scholars, but of course we also see tech companies making that argument, right? Yes, this has to do with us, all this fake news, but we are also therefore the only ones who can fix it, so just leave it in our hands and we will work it out, right? And one thing that's interesting there is, again, we can see again and again how the narrative and the metaphors of a virus and this framing of fake news not only structure descriptions, but also structure solutions. So this is a quote from Jack Dorsey from Twitter, the CEO and founder of Twitter. So when asked to present his plan or Twitter's plan on how to fix fake news or post-truth, he argued, if you want to improve something, you have to be able to measure it. The human body has a number of indicators of overall health, some very simple, like internal temperature. We know how to measure it, and we know some methods to bring it back in balance. What we know is we must commit to measure the health of public conversation on Twitter. So here, the notion of this being similar to a disease infecting the body is being used as Twitter's strategy, right? That they will first find a way to measure the health of public conversation, and then they will be able to fix it, right? But obviously, what is completely left out of such a quote and such a solution is the power relations behind that, right? Who gets to decide what is a healthy public conversation? First of all, what are the criteria for that, and who gets that power? And also, what are you going to do about it if these criteria shows that it's unhealthy, right? And that is, of course, completely left out of such a solution. And so this is where one of the key arguments of our book is that the medical vocabulary depoliticizes both this problem and also solutions. That by presenting fake news as a virus, human agency is kind of removed from the production of disinformation and propaganda and manipulation, right? Because it becomes this thing that kind of spreads on its own. It has a kind of life of its own. But then also removing it becomes kind of an apolitical issue, right? Because who is against, obviously in these COVID times, some are against removing a virus. But I mean, normally you would say like, who can be against removing the plague of an epidemic or a pandemic, right? So again, this way of framing it in a very problematic way shapes the kind of solutions we're seeing. And again, this also explains, I think, why so many different leaders across the world have used this debate to legitimize censorship laws. Because again, from the perspective of post-truth, this post-truth narrative, the virus needs to be removed with radical measures, and it's not really an issue of political power, or it's not really an issue of democratic debate, for example. It's an issue of some kind of disease that we need to remove by any means necessary. And this is then also something we've seen since our book came out with censorship laws both being enacted and record numbers of journalists being arrested under like fake news charges in a lot of countries, but also these kind of emergency bills like in Hungary being rolled out during COVID, where journalists or others could be facing jail time for spreading fake news, right? So this is certainly something that is still ongoing and struggles that are very much happening as we speak. And luckily, I mean, we have also seen contestation work. For example, in Malaysia, they rolled out a fake news law, anti-fake news law, but with the change of government and extensive work from activists, it ended up being also reversed this law and taken back. There I can recommend a report from 2020 by April Lim about the Malaysian case, where she's interviewed activists fighting this fake news law. But this kind of research, as like studying the Malaysian case of how people are contesting the fake news law, so little research has been done in that, and especially compared to how much has come out on fake news as this kind of reified phenomenon. So this is where I want to put post-truth briefly into perspective, hopefully without going too much over time. So I mean, the first question, obvious question we have to ask if we want to put post-truth into perspective is, when was this supposed truth era, right? When was this glorious time of truth that we should be longing for, right? And obviously there wasn't no such time, and this is one of the key critiques against this narrative, right? That it is presenting an idea of something gone awry, something gone wrong, but there is no real notion of where we should be going or what we should be going back to, right? And this is also, especially in the US, where this term really took off, problematic in itself, right? And I think here the scholars, critical media scholars, Robert Mejia and colleagues, they did a wonderful article called A Racial History of the Post-Truth. And here they write, post-truth criticism can be dangerous because it often fails to recognize the uneven benefits and consequences of our historical and contemporary truth-telling regimes. It often expresses nostalgia for those supposedly simpler days when the truth meant something, and it recenters whiteness throughout. It is troubling to suggest that we now live in a post-truth era when our history includes the 3/5 compromise, ongoing segregation, uneven drug policies, and other atrocities. So that is like one key critique, right? And related to that, we could also ask, if we are in a sudden crisis of truth, what are the indicators of that crisis? And there, if we could look at some indicators of democratic crisis, then there doesn't seem to be any sudden crisis in terms of voting, for example, but rather a very long crisis, a very gradual decline in voting, for example. So voter turnout has been declining, but it has been declining for decades on a global scale. So we don't see any kind of rapid movement going on here. The same if we look at trust in government in the US. It is at an all-time low, trust in government, but it doesn't. There's nothing rapid or sudden going on. Of course, we should always be a bit critical about the representativeness of surveys from like the 60s and 70s, right? But again, we can at least say there's something much more gradual going on. There's something much more slow and sinister going on. And this is, of course, where it's interesting to know that critical political theories have long argued that democracy is indeed in a crisis, yet it is a very different kind of crisis than a post-truth one. And it is one that is much more gradual, right? And so here we draw on scholars like Wolfgang Streeck and Jacques Rancière, Colin Crouch, and Chantal Mouffe. And I mean, Chantal Mouffe's way of portraying this or explaining this is that in order to understand this gradual crisis, we have to understand that democracy, liberal democracy, is fundamentally a compromise between two opposing traditions, in many ways opposing traditions, which is why it's a paradox, right? We have the liberal tradition on the one hand emphasizing individual rights, the rule of law, and liberal markets, and then we have the democratic tradition emphasizing popular sovereignty, egalitarianism, and rule of the people. And what Mouffe is arguing has happened not suddenly, but over a number of decades, is that the liberal tradition has come to dominate over the democratic tradition, right? Politics has become increasingly centered on managing the state of globalized markets and the economy, and thus the difference between political parties, the center-left and the center-right, has become increasingly negligible, which is also why people no longer kind of care about politics to the same extent. And this is what she calls the age of post-politics, right? And what has also been called the age of post-democracy, that politics has become increasingly technocratic, focused on this kind of consensus around managing the status quo of markets and growth, and not about presenting new visions for how democracy could be structured. And so this is not I mean, what is important to stress here is that this is not an age like post-democracy of democracy no longer existing, right? The democratic institutions are still there. It's just that their function has increasingly become an empty shell in terms of representing fundamentally opposing visions and mitigating between those fundamentally opposing visions about where democracy should be heading, and more stabilized around this market consensus, right? And this is again where that presents a very different explanations for the decline in voting. So as Wolfgang Streeck writes, everything suggests that declining electoral participation in the capitalist democracies is a sign not of contentment, but of resignation. The losers from the neoliberal turn cannot see what they might get from a change in government. The TINA, there is no alternative politics of globalization, has long arrived at the bottom of society, where voting no longer makes a difference in the eyes of those who would have the most to gain from political change. And so this is then kind of where we see the key dangers of these post-truth discourses, because not only do they kind of fail to account for what these critical scholars have argued for so long, and this much more gradual crisis of democracy, but all these solutions also revolve around entrenching the liberal tradition instead of revitalizing the democratic tradition. So it's all about limiting the voice of the people, right, through various censorship laws that will remove the virus, and then of course giving increased powers to these private tech companies, letting them measure the health and decide what is healthy and remove what is unhealthy and these kind of things, right? So in this way, post-truth not only kind of fails to account for the crisis of democracy, but also is a kind of doubling down on post-politics, in the sense of saying what we need to solve the crisis of post-politics is more post-politics. We need to really entrench that further. So that's the risk, we argue, that it risks entrenching the status quo, illegitimizing genuine calls for societal change, undermine popular sovereignty, and worsen an existing democratic crisis. And again, this is, I think, what we are seeing, especially in weaker democracies and newer democracies, where that has really taken on this narrative of post-truth in terms of then legitimizing arresting journalists or making it illegal to spread fake news and so forth. And I think we need much more research into that. And then, like a final note before I end it, is that a question I often get asked is that, but then how do we explain 2016, right? How do we explain Trump or Brexit? Because that was the whole point of this post-truth narrative from the start, right? To explain why we saw these unexpected, at least for political elites, developments. And I think here, Mouffe also provides a very different and constructive answer. So she argues it is high time to realize that to a great extent, the success of right-wing populist parties comes from the fact that they articulate, albeit in a very problematic way, real democratic demands which are not taken into account by traditional parties. They also provide people with some form of hope, with the belief that things could be different. Of course, it is an illusory hope, founded on false premises and unacceptable mechanisms of exclusion, where xenophobia usually plays a central role. But when they are the only channels for the expression of political passions, their presence to represent an alternative is very seductive. This is why I submit that the success of right-wing populist parties is the consequence of a lack of a vibrant democratic debate in our post-democracies. So from this perspective, we could say that in order to understand both the election of Trump and Brexit that same year, we need to understand these as the binary choices they are, right, between the status quo and something presenting itself as draining the swamp and being radically different, right? And so again, instead of seeing this as mainly the result of something that is depolitical, a virus spreading online, we need to see it as something deeply political, and thus also think of solutions and contestation in that line of thinking. So that is kind of my conclusion, right? To return to the start, I don't think this is a good description of the state of democracy, but I also think that there are some dangers to these narratives that should be contested. And of course, we should also think about how we can present alternative visions, both alternative descriptions of the crisis of democracy, which I think we can, most people can agree that there is a crisis, but at the same time also try to present different types of visions for where democracy could be going, not just this doubling down on post-politics. And this might sound like a very bleak note to end there. In one sense that like we both have disinformation online, new forms and fake profiles, which is what I'm studying. And then we also have all these narratives about it that just makes it worse. But I think, again, this was our whole motivation for writing that book, that to say that there is certainly still time to present alternative visions. This is not locked in place. We are seeing these censorship laws, which are being rolled out and being rolled back and fought over. So we as academics also have a chance to present different visions and different types of descriptions of the problems of democracy. And there, I think, in terms of fake news, the key thing is to start studying fake news as the political signifier it is, and with the kind of different ramifications it is having in different contexts. And that is something we need to really explore. So with that, I would say thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to discussing this with you.
Johan, thank you so much for that. That was a really fantastic presentation. I absolutely love how you take these ubiquitous signifiers, post-truth and fake news, and you use them to ultimately tell a story about the nature of how we think of democracy, how we think of politics, and political, and so on. There was a lot of things I was really impressed about. One of the things that I thought was really great, there's a lot being written in the last 20 years about the need to de-Westernize media studies, media and communication studies. This was a brilliant exemplar. For somebody based in a European university, this was just brilliant to think about this problem in a way that is genuinely globalized, genuinely transnational. Because it seems to me one of the problems with a lot of the fake news discourse is sort of westernized democracies talking to themselves, not thinking about how some of these debates, these signifiers could be appropriated elsewhere. So I don't want to say too much, and I want to give everybody to take some time to think about questions they want to formulate. But Johan, just to get the Q&A going, I wanted to ask you a very general question. What has been the response of journalists to your book? Because I know your book has got, it's been well received within the academy, but it's also, I think I saw on Twitter that you had been interviewed by the press in Denmark and so on. So there's been this wider public interest in the argument. And your argument in the book is a subtle one. You critique a kind of conception of democracy that's too narrowly focused on notions of, reason, truth, the real, rational, and so on. You don't say that we should somehow discard all those concepts. You instead want us to re-articulate them in a way that thinks about democracy in this broader sense. But this seems interesting from a journalistic perspective, because journalistic subjectivity is particularly invested in those concepts, yeah? So, go back to the general question. How has the response been of journalists, and what has been interesting about the cultural politics even of that response?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So in my PhD thesis then, which I'm hopefully handing in next year, and that is actually about how journalists in Denmark, so the national context I know best, how they both cover fake news, and also I've interviewed a lot of journalists about how they reflect on this, both the term and also covering it. And I think one thing, of course, that is that has been key for journalists, and one of the reasons we've also seen these concepts of fake news and post-truth take off is, of course, that it's been a key way for journalists in their crisis of revenue mainly, right, that has been taken up by digital platforms, to really double down on the importance of their identity as like truth speakers and so forth. So we have seen also, in the US, but also in a country like Denmark, and I think that has also been a global trend, like newspapers putting out ads about themselves, or like writing about themselves, saying that like we are the defense against fake news, right? We are what will save us all from this thing. And I think there, for example, in my local context of Denmark, what is interesting, of course, is that fake news is very much presenting as this other, right? It's always outside of, it's like coming from Russia and coming from coming from outside journalism, for example, and coming from outside politicians saying it's coming from outside politics, which is also why we're seeing this securitization of the issue, which is something that deserves more attention, that it's turned into this military issue also, right? Security agencies getting more funding to fight the disinformation threat. And there, I think what is interesting is that there are some clear internal paradoxes also. Like, so I interviewed some journalists who work in institutions where the editor has put out like statements saying, we are the Danish defense against fake news and the elections, that kind of thing. And the journalist who is most specialized in studying like online misinformation is very skeptical towards that narrative, right? So there are also a lot of internal tensions there in journalism, which deserves more attention. But what we've seen journalists do with fake news is very much to do the same for their field as we have seen with like post-politics, like in the sense of journalists, at least institutions, often saying, we have this huge new threat of fake news. What we need to do is to do the same as we've done this whole time. You just need to like pay more attention to us, right? So like they double down on the notion of journalistic objectivity, double down on the notion of journalists being like the watchdogs of society and so forth, right? So it's also, I think that is also part of explaining why it became such a big topic, that for journalists themselves, it became a way of, in the face of revenue crisis, of saying, we are on the right track. We've been doing the right thing this whole time. We are very important and so forth, right? Yeah. So, but when I'm talking to journalists, to be honest, they mainly call me to, because I mean, I have also studied fake profiles and that kind of thing. So they mainly call me to say like, is this fake? Is this, how big a threat is fake news? And I have definitely often in both Denmark and Sweden, where I'm most often talking to journalists, experienced that when I then give my answer of not wanting to like contribute to this narrative of like people being beyond reality and democracy being in a state of post-truth, that sometimes when I then talk to them, apparently that those quotes are not that interesting, or like I don't become part of that article. They found someone else, right? So yeah, so I think there isn't like, journalists are not too open to that kind of critique, but it is also but academia is not either, I would say. Like, of course, again, some audiences are, but I've also faced like the classic critique of like post-structuralism, like you are relativizing all this, and some have argued, even in academia, that it's like postmodernism that has caused all of this. So yeah, so I'm sure some will see me being part of that problem.
Thank you, Johan. I see a contribution from Jessica in the chat that actually speaks to the point Johan just made about postmodernism. Jessica, you listed 3 provocations. I'm quite happy if you want to come back and formulate a question in light of what Johan said. So we have 3 speakers who are 3 people who are keen to ask questions. We start in the order of Alexander, Peter, and Timo. So Alexander, please unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank everyone. I wanted to thank Sean for organizing this lecture, and for Johan for accepting to be the first speaker. It was really, really a wonderful start of this series. I'm not a specialist in these topics, so my question is really open, and just a follow-up on Sean's question. Also partly on your final comment about alternative visions that should be explored. I was wondering, do you have an inkling of what would be a better way of talking about these issues? Also, perhaps talking to journalists or politicians, like, we know what they shouldn't do, I think, from your book and from your talk so far. But what would be a way for them perhaps to approach this? And I know this is a huge question, but just if you have some ideas.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and something I've been thinking a lot about. I think again, the by seeing how this kind of post-truth narrative is limiting the ways we are currently thinking, I think that is like the first step towards asking different questions, right? So I think that was like the goal of our book, to show that it is a very limiting narrative, not so much to outline these alternatives, but that is something I've since thought a lot about. So for example, when it comes to social media platforms, which clearly need regulation, again, the post-truth narrative has limited the debate in a way where, which has also been advantageous for the platforms, because regulation of social media has been equated to regulating speech, right, in many of these debates. Then the platforms can use that to say, but you don't want to censor people, you don't want to, so don't regulate us. But obviously there's so many ways we could regulate tech, right? We could put taxes on them, we could force them to be transparent in terms of letting journalists and researchers get data. We could limit micro-targeting or ban micro-targeting, and limit what kind of data they can extract and what they can sell, and like there are all these and we could break up Facebook, right? I mean, there's so many ways that we can politically intervene in terms of the immense power of social media platforms that is being completely neglected by this narrative. And that's also something, in terms of what journalists ask me, then they call me and they say, is it a good or bad thing that Twitter removed Trump? Again, it becomes all framed around them like regulating speech, where we could regulate, like should ask, first of all, how has so few platforms become so immensely powerful? Do we want that? And like, don't we want to break that up? But then we could also ask again, don't we want some of that incredible revenue going to these platforms, for example, going into like critical journalism or research or like other kinds of initiatives? I mean, I don't feel I have the answers to that, but I feel I have a very clear sense of how the post-truth narrative has given a kind of tunnel vision as to what kind of solutions are being presented, which is again being exploited by the social media companies, because they, for example, also want it to be framed in this way, where it's like you can regulate speech or you can leave us alone, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Johan. Peter, if you would like to unmic or unmute yourself, sorry.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Johan, for your presentation. I have three questions, but they are very much linked to one another. So in the end, you said that fake news discourses or post-truth discourses can entrench post-politics. But I'm wondering, can we still talk about post-politics today? Not in the sense of literally talking about it, but in the sense of it being a dominant force. Today, as I have the feeling that this is not, I hear little statements anymore that particular thing that there is no alternative, for instance, for particular ideas or particular policies. Especially if we look at the economic field, everything has become possible, and everything can be said by anyone at which institution, whatever today. So can we still talk about post-politics as if post-politics is still a dominating force today? That's my first question. And my second would be, would you agree that it's a better term to talk about post-trust societies today rather than post-truth societies, and that the notion of post-trust is more related to the populist moment that Chantal Mouffe talks about that has replaced post-politics? And then lastly, what would you, if we then look at genuine concerns in terms of the anti-vax movements, for instance, which I can also feel here in Belgium is quite prevalent, and I see many people on my Facebook attacking, for instance, the public broadcaster for not giving enough voice to alternative ideas on the pandemic, or the election results in the case of Trump. If you see, as you explained at the beginning of the presentation, that discourse also leads to action and has material consequences. How should we look at topics like that and information like that spreading without falling into the trap of the post-truth discourses? Yes, those were my questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Three big and I mean challenging ones, but yeah, thank you so much for raising them. I think in terms of the first thing, I think I mean we live in interesting times in terms of post-politics, in the sense that now, obviously, with COVID, it has become very clear that this, which I think has been consensus-based, still a vision of like the economy being something very fixed and something like we can't spend more than we get in, and this kind of rhetoric suddenly being completely thrown up in the air, like all types of governments saying, oh, suddenly we actually had 100 billion here we could use for this crisis, right? So suddenly, I think on the other side, that would be interesting. How would they then say, yeah, but then now we are back to the like no vision kind of politics. Now there's no money for a new vision, or that kind of thing, or no change in sight. But at the same time, I don't think we are over post politics, or that kind of that it doesn't is a useful term. I don't think, like, I'm not a big fan of like monolithic concepts. I don't think we should like raise it up as it has more of a heuristic also sometimes, this type of concept. But for example, now the election of Biden, I feel, has in the US has been very much based on an argument of going back to normal after something chaotic, right? That we return now to like rational consensus, right? But obviously this COVID thing is might present itself as a moment for radically new visions, right? But it might, of course, also be, let's see how successful politicians will be in convincing the public afterwards of going back to what was before, right? I think in a lot of countries, people are asking, how come you didn't have money for like schools or healthcare, and said we had no money, and apparently all these industries can get these huge bailouts and all these things, right? Yeah, so that was one thing. Post-trust, I mean, again, I think it all depends on what we put into such a concept as post-trust. I must admit that I've mainly seen it used by people arguing for the same narrative as post-truth, just with a different concept. But I don't know if that is also like, we could put other meanings into that, right? In the sense of this being related to a crisis of political participation or popular sovereignty. But I think, again, the risk of such a concept is that it becomes reduced. It reduces politics to being just mainly about trust, right? That a good system is one where we have a ruling class that decides anything, but as long as people have trust in them, then we are fine, right? Obviously, that's not a very democratic society. We could imagine an authoritarian state, potentially, right, where people really like the authoritarian leader and trust him, acting him. So, I mean, that in that sense, I don't know if a trust society is necessarily a very democratic one. I think that's a limit of that kind of concept and the notion of post-trust. I think, again, in any kind of description of the crisis, we need to also contain, we need to also think about how solutions to that crisis should lead to a more democratic society, right? That's a normative argument I'm raising. So I think that's the problem with post-truth and post-trust, that we can imagine a truth society, a trust society that's not very democratic at all. And this is, again, the problem. So was that, and then what to do about the people who are, yeah, obviously there are people who feel very disillusioned about both like politics and the state of things, and that is certainly a global trend. I think, again, a risk of that post-truth narrative is it doesn't emphasize any kind of need to understand what drives people to various types of beliefs, and because it all becomes centered on, again, removing that virus, right? But of course, if you remove all COVID disinformation also, for example, you don't really get to the bottom of what are the historic reasons, for example, that some groups are distrustful of medical authorities or the medical industry, for example, right? And there we can definitely also see reasons for wanting to regulate that industry, or now in these patent times with the COVID vaccine, like discuss whether we want intellectual property laws to make it impossible to get vaccines to certain parts of the world. And I mean, there are, again, we have to frame the problem we are identifying in a way that enables us to talk about making our societies more democratic. I think that's the most important part, and I don't think these post-truth narratives are really advancing that currently. And again, we're back to the journalist calling me. It's mainly about, again, how much is out there and how much should we remove, and that kind of thing. And I don't really think it advances the talks we really should be having about democracy.
Thanks, Johan. Our next question is from Timo Harjanemi, based at Helsinki University. I am conscious I would like to see some gender balance in terms of the question, so I'm insisting that we sort of address that, and I'm afraid the fact that Jessica turns out to be Robert Porter is not sufficient on this front. So Timo, please.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Johan. Thanks for the great talk and a great book. It's been a great inspiration for me, at least. I just would like to touch upon a quite specific theme of your talk. I'm sort of been fascinated with these parallels with the early 20th century that you bring up in your book as well. You bring up Lippmann and his sort of critique of mass democracy and sort of the contemporary early 20th century media market. And I sort of and I guess that the response back then to this crisis of truth or crisis of the media was sort of the establishment of contemporary professional journalism ethics and the birth of what you could sort of call national media policy and the establishment of, for example, public service broadcasting. This was sort of a way to bring sort of the media market to a certain amount of democratic control, I guess. And I guess this is sort of the age that you could perhaps refer to as the age of truth, sort of this environment regulated by professional journalists and established experts and political elites and what have you. So to continue on this parallel, it would, and this sort of goes back to the first comment, would be to think of social media, for example, as a public utility that should be brought under democratic control and under perhaps, I don't know, state broadcasting or something like that. And I was just wondering if you could just perhaps further elaborate on this idea. It sort of seems like an sort of an obvious answer, but on the other hand, it's really on the other hand, it's quite hard to see something like this taking place. So I was just wondering, could you elaborate on the feasibility of such policy ideas, so to speak?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and lovely to hear that you found our book useful in terms of that. And I think also much more work can be done on these kind of historical parallels, because again, what has really characterized this post-truth debate is also just the deeply ahistorical nature of it, right? And so it's, again, this kind of suddenness that it's all suddenly happening, and as if democracy was in this very stable condition beforehand. In terms of that, I think you're right in terms of like that was the result of Lippmann's critique. But obviously, we should also be critical of the notion that was a truth era, right? Because that was in the US, like there was still segregation for several decades after that. So that didn't seem to be part of that vision of democracy, right? And this is again the problem. I mean, an irony I thought about, but we didn't put it in the book, but I've thought about since, of course, that there's an irony to the fact that it was 2016 that really launched the Make America Great Again slogan, and then launched Post-Truth, because Post-Truth is kind of the liberal elite version of Make America Great Again, right? Let's take us back to a golden age that never existed and so forth. And of course, also with Lippmann, we, for example, find something very telling in his use of the term all the time, that the influential men should decide, right? So it is a very elitist and very limiting idea about what democratic participation is. But with that, but I mean, in terms of that, talking about social media and that as a public utility, I mean, I think those are the kind of discussions we should be having, and it amazes me that we haven't had again. But or like not, I guess not amazes me because it is like in the time of post-politics. But these are exactly the kind of visions that are lacking there, and where again, post-truth only offers us this talk about regulating speech. I think we are beyond, at least as a first step. I don't think it makes sense to propose to make them like public. But just the fact that we are not even regulating, like taxing ads or taxing these companies and using their money for public goods. I think like if we first open those gates, there might be a change of later down the line also talking about them as even more public utilities. But yeah, so I think these are the kind of discussions we should be highlighting. But I don't think we should like glorify those days just after Lippmann in terms of being like a democratic, great democratic era, right? That's the problem that was highlighted in that racial history of post-truth article I talked about. And again, I see such potential for this kind of work. Again, that is something that surprises me. When we wrote Fingers of Floating Signifier, to be honest, I was quite sure that a lot of other people were presenting similar arguments very soon and try to study this politicization. And it is starting to happen now, but I think there's so much potential there.
Thank you, Johan. I see that there's been no takers on my previous prompt, so the invitation is still open. But for now, I guess we'll go Robert Porter from the University of Ulster, who listed, some of you will have seen, a few provocations in the chat box. So Robert, do you want to formulate that as a question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for the invitation to the event, and thanks, Johan, for a really interesting paper. I'll be on Amazon later, nipping that book into my basket. So you've got a sale there. Well done. I suppose the provocations are statements that I thought might crystallize a discussion around what I would see as a couple of key issues that are brought into real focus by your work. I mean, the first one, I suppose, is to do with your reliance on radical democratic theory. So the provocation there, democracy is not a good thing. That was supposed to be democracy is not necessarily a good thing. And you've already kind of explained why that's the case, given the kind of historical contingencies of how we even understand the notion of democracy, what that might mean for someone like Lippmann, vis-a-vis what that might mean for us, vis-a-vis what that might mean for wherever and whenever. So that's the first question. I suppose it's to do with the knotty problem of using radical democratic theory as a kind of ontology that maps the use of a concept, say in this case post-truth or whatever, but also the normative problem that you have in assuming, by connecting it back to the issue of democracy, that democracy itself is a good thing, and that then informs your kind of normative judgment vis-a-vis the phenomena that you want to look at. So that's the first kind of question that I would have, and it's a very, very tricky one. So and I think it's kind of interesting to think of it in those terms and think of it in historical terms that you have, but it doesn't get around the problem of thinking that democracy is normatively a good thing. And the second point that the third point is insignificant. The second point that I think is worth mentioning it's just around this kind of language. And we had a conversation a bit about this the other day when Sean presented some of his work at our university. And it's to do with getting involved in a kind of discourse, and a game, a discursive game that in some senses you possibly can never win, because post-truth might float as a signifier, right? But it takes an infrastructure for something to float, and some things float better than others. And the whole discourse of post-truth and fake news and so on has a kind of infrastructure and funding that comes from the right, politically, comes from the right. And engaging in a conversation about post-truth you might be engaging in a discursive game that you can't win, because they're better, to put it crudely, they're better funded than you are. So those are a couple of thoughts that I had. The first one was just around the concept of democracy itself, and the work that you see that doing normatively for your critique, because in a sense your critique was a critique of normativity and value in relation to these concepts, but you yourself cannot abstract yourself from that. And then the second question is around, are you getting sucked into a vortex of kind of discourses of post-truth that it's a game that you're just never ever gonna win? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on those issues, if they make sense, first of all.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think they make sense. They are definitely difficult, but I'll try to address them. So the first thing, I think, again, this historical, perspective, I think, is needed. I think that book the historian Sophia Rosenfeld wrote, which is like a short guide to democracy and truth, it's called, was quite useful in that term also, and we need more of that, like books that really highlight how in many ways, like, the roots of democracy have always been deeply exclusionary, like also from these kind of Enlightenment philosophers, like they never wanted to include like the people in that narrative, right? It was an elitist vision in many ways. And I think that's important to remember, right? Also in this kind of post-truth or post, like that it's not about, we shouldn't be nostalgic about too nostalgic about the past, right? And that is also a critique I think I can be raised up the notion of post-politics. I like that it is like glorifying some state of what before. But what I think is so powerful about the notion of democracy, and I guess in my talk now, democracy comes off as a more kind of stable or reified entity than in the book, where we kind of try to highlight how we want to criticize that type of perspective. Is that democracy, I think, and that is also what Chantal Mouffe might be arguing, right, with the notion of radical democracy, that democracy is a very powerful concept that we can use. I mean, again, also because it is being already, like, very few people in liberal democracies are openly against democracy as a system, right? So it's a signifier that we can also imbue with more meaning than it currently has, in terms of saying, how can we make the society more democratic? Also as a way of trying to convince others of a more radical vision of democracy, in terms of saying, if you are pro-democracy, don't you want, I mean, these are ways that we could make it more democratic. And so I don't think we should see democracy as any kind of stable entity, but also normatively, and that's also our argument, right? We use the term democracy as saying that we want more democracy on a normative level, that we think society is better if people are involved in decision making, and if the same people who feel the effects of policies are also the ones influenced in making them, and of course living in societies that are not unequal and run by elites and so forth. I mean, economic elites. So in that sense, those are all normative claims, right? So I'm not claiming to have any kind of to be outside of discourse or being outside normativity. And I think democracy is a very powerful term, and researchers can also use it to pose those questions. in the visions of democracy, not just post-truth, but other visions of democracy, what is currently completely being left out, and what could we think of as other ways of making our societies more democratic that is not currently part of that vision, right? Structure. So I guess that was my response to that. And then the second part about what you're up against, or again, this is why our whole intervention, or what we could call it, like our whole motivation for writing this book, it was very much as an intervention, as also a call for scholars to try to engage with this topic in a different way, because I think we felt that even scholars on the left, or like critical scholars, were too uncritically adopting and playing in that game of post-truth. And I think on a positive note, I think what this whole debacle of post-truth has showed us is that academia is part of something very powerful, even though it might not feel like it when we are sitting in our home offices. And like, when you look at these censorship laws being rolled out, directly being legitimized back to the notion of post-truth and fake news, which is where scholars have played a key role in advancing these terms from the start, of course, through journalism. Journalism has played a perhaps even bigger role. But I mean, that actually shows us that that there is a discursive power of the academy that is not just
absolutely,
not just a kind of an ivory tower. And so from that, we can actually take something positive of saying, if we could articulate other visions for and highlight other problems of democratic participation right now, or like democracy in terms of what is being neglected, what is being oppressed, also that there is potential for presenting alternative visions. But the first thing we have to do is to think more critically about what kind of concepts also we adopt, and what kind of narratives we play along with. And unfortunately, that has not happened, right? Like, if you look at number of articles coming out using the term fake news, it's just overwhelming, right? It's just insane. And if you look into that, I haven't seen anyone systematically mapping it, but the number of people then, I mean, not really looking at the political, this is a political signifier, or how this has like the material consequences in terms of laws, but just looking at like it as a form of information that can be removed from the digital realm. I mean, those numbers are quite depressing. But again, I think there is potential, and that's kind of what has been our whole, again, motivation, why we really felt we wanted to write this book, because I hope that it can just spark a little bit of more critical scholarship in terms of
absolutely. Well, I think you should keep up the good work. I think it's great. And I think your point about the material facts of these discourses is very, very well taken. And I think when you kind of pivot on the university system itself and how complicit or not universities are in a lot of this stuff, again, a point that Sean was making the other day in relation to his own work, I think those are crucial issues going forward. But great talk, thank you very much. And I really look forward to reading the book.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the tough questions.
Sorry about that.
Thank you, Robert. Johan.
Pleasure.
We now, Kathleen, you'd like to ask the question, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, very interesting talk. I'm also not an expert on the topic, and I bought your book, but I haven't found the time to read it. So I apologize if you address it in the book. But when you speak about like democracy and like post-democracy and like maybe giving the voice back to citizens more, I was wondering how you think about like more alternative forms of organizing democracy. Like there's an influential Belgian author who wrote an entire book making a claim against elections in a democracy and talking about like the new projects with a more deliberative, citizen-led democracy. And I wondered, what you think about that, because that might be a solution for like the bigger problems. It might address all voices in a society more than like representatives, like that is based on like a random selection of citizens who then form some sort of parliament and they make the decisions instead of having like representative talking in their place.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I'm not familiar with this specific book, but I mean, I think the fact that like rethinking how democracy could be more democratic than it is now through other means is a line of thinking I obviously think is very important. But in terms, I mean, I guess following Mouffe, perhaps my worry of such a proposal, or like, again, I think sometimes things become presented as if like we should do something completely different, like all institutions should be restructured or dismantled, and I think in some cases the risk there is obviously that it becomes kind of too far-fetched also for people to be able to follow. And I think, again, when we think of something like how social media could become more democratic, as I'm thinking a lot about, we could think about making them into something completely different and like publicly owned and that kind of thing, which I'm all sympathetic towards. But at the same time, I'm also just seeing there are so many things that would be right in front of us that would be so easy to do, but we're still not discussing. So like it's the key problem right now is not just that like radical new visions are not being listened to, but just like the very near small or like and helpful things that could be done. Something like put a big tax on social media companies and use that money for some of these things that are problems in terms of like people's access to education or critical research or journalism, investigative journalism, and these kind of things that are not being discussed. But I'm deeply sympathetic towards these kind of debates. And so again, I guess our vision in this book is not really to present any kind of concrete ideas as to how democracy should be structured differently, but again, to show how post-truth debate is limiting the current kind of visions we can talk about and the problem that comes with that. So I don't think you will find kind of those type of answers in the book. Yeah, so that might be. I hope it's still interesting to read, but the key point again for us is to highlight, like, to show what is all these things that are being neglected by framing our society as being post-truth and framing it about fake news. And I gave a lecture actually for Russian students at University of Moscow last week. And for example, there also, when we then discussed how like the Russian horrible political situation, they also, you could also see like the problem there is sometimes everyone is now being is thinking in very limited terms as to what has to be done. So I was asked, like, do you think media literacy will help in Russia? And I think like media literacy is like this not the biggest of your concerns in Russia, right? Like you don't have, like, the political opposition is being literally murdered, and so I don't think it's about like you being able to better spot when RT is lying. I mean this is I don't know, a bit about perhaps also provocative statement. It was not to like dismiss any calls for media literacy. It can be fine to talk about media literacy, but it's not like gonna solve democracy's problem, and it's certainly not going to solve those in a country like Russia. So again, we need to understand also in a globalized economy, it's also often a globalized, like these kind of hegemonic ideas such as post-truth. I think I have personally been surprised by the extent of these discourses, and I have no idea of the exact extent because it's so big and we need so many more studies. But like the fact that countries like Honduras and Kenya and Singapore are all implementing anti-fake news laws, calling it that is something quite remarkable, right? And I think, again, this is where it is so limiting, because not only is it super helpful in Western democracies, but it's also not very helpful in these kind of debates, I think, in weak or authoritarian states. Yeah.
Okay, I'm conscious we're right at the 90-minute mark. I will make time just for one, if anybody wants to ask one quick on-screen question, that opening is there. And I'll also just briefly pose a question that Kurt Sengel, who's watching in bed from Australia, you kind of touched on this a little bit, Johan, but maybe talk about it a little bit more explicitly. Kurt asked, are you noticing a change in how the academy is talking about post-truth now compared to 2016, 2017? As Kurt says, it felt like new special issues were emerging every couple of weeks after Trump and Brexit. We could talk about it as the kind of high point of the fake news industry. So where are things at in terms of 2021?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I do feel like, on the positive note, I feel there are critical studies taking up this kind of thinking of trying to critically study the again, these kind of the securitization of fake news. For example, some scholars in critical security studies are studying that, like how it becomes the security issue, and how that has some disturbing material consequences in the terms of like militarization and that kind of thing. But that is still like on the margins. I'm hoping that it will become like at least what we could call like a critical subfield or something. But generally, most studies that come out are still these kind of quantitative studies trying to map the extent of fake news and these things. And I'm not saying that is completely useless, right? I've also done studies of the IRA's campaign in the US and how they used fake profiles to infiltrate Black Lives Matter movement and these kind of things. Obviously, this is very important to study, and it is a threat. It was also a threat during the Cold War, right? It's not exactly a new threat, but it is taking new forms, and that is interesting. But I feel much more needs to be done on that. And of course, research is slow. So even though it exploded in 2016, still like now the grants have been given, and it's also become an industry of like disinformation research. So yeah, I feel there's a long way to go. At least I think more voices are saying maybe we shouldn't just uncritically use the term fake news, right? So that's something. But instead of them saying we need to study why it is so political and how it is so political and critically kind of try to dismantle that or unpack that, they're saying let's use this other concept, right? And what is interesting about that is, like, if you look at the history of these terms, all terms related to fake news have, in one way or another, this history of being a deeply political concept. So, for example, a lot of scholars are saying we shouldn't use disinformation because we shouldn't use fake news, we should rather use disinformation. But if you look at the history of disinformation, this term was supposedly coined by Stalin to try to delegitimize his opponents and like foreign powers. And supposedly gave it even like a French-sounding name, what he thought of as a French-sounding name to make it a more like something coming from foreign actors. And the notion of big lie, which has been used now in relation to Trump and the insurgents and like the coup attempt, that term comes from Hitler, right? From Mein Kampf, where he talks about Jews and the big lie. The big lie being that Jews. The Jewish people, according to him, were responsible for Germany's loss in World War I, right? And that being a big lie that it was covered over. So there's no concept related to this field, I think, that doesn't have this politicization built into it, because this kind of struggle over truth and over like manipulation is always implicated in much wider power relations. And again, I feel that is being neglected by the field, and I don't think replacing one concept with another fixes that, right? But obviously, that's the first step towards more critical thinking. I'm also been pleased to see not as many people just uncritically adopt the notion of infodemic as we saw. And what is deeply interesting about infodemic, someone please do a study. I don't have time, I have to finish this thesis. But infodemic, what is interesting about that is that the WHO, who kind of said we are in an infodemic, they said like the infodemic is not just wrong information, right? It's also correct information. That's all part of the infodemic. infodemic, which is quite interesting because it pathologizes all types of sharing of information, right? Which is quite fascinating because it kind of implies that there's a problem with that, even when it's correct information. I mean, those kind of discourses around the infodemic and what that is and how it's being used. I would love to read a study about that. Perhaps someone is working on it, but yeah.
Thank you, Johan. To put it in the philosophical jargon, it's such a brilliant ending to a fantastic presentation to emphasize that all our concepts are always already political. They're always politicized. There's nothing that's innocent of politics. So I want to thank you again, Johan. That was just a fantastic talk. And I want to thank everybody. Most of the audience have been here for the whole 90 minutes. And I want to thank everybody for brilliant contributions and questions. I've already got an email to say from somebody to say they enjoyed this so much they're going to be coming to the other seminars. And they also noted correctly, I think, that with that Johan is a hard act to follow because he's really set an impressive standard today. So I want to thank everybody again and hopefully see maybe, most of you at the future seminar. So thanks again, Johan.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Johan. Thanks, Sean, for organizing.
Okay.
Take care,
Cheers.
guys. See you next. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.